In the frozen winter of 1943, somewhere in the Nazi-occupied countryside of Belgium, an elderly woman stood by her stone fireplace and made a decision that would send dozens of German supply trains to their fiery graves. Her name was Margaret Thornhill, a 67-year-old widow with arthritic hands and a face weathered by decades of farm work, and she had just become the most unlikely spy in the Allied resistance. Every morning at exactly 6 o'clock, she would light her fireplace, but the smoke that rose from her chimney was not just smoke. It was a coded message written in grey and black plumes, visible from 30,000 feet in the sky, telling British bomber crews exactly where to strike. The Nazis never suspected the grandmother baking bread in her kitchen was the reason their ammunition depots kept exploding, their fuel reserves kept burning, and their soldiers kept dying in perfectly timed air raids. This is the story they erased from the history books, the story of how an old woman's chimney became the deadliest weapon the Allies never acknowledged, and how she paid the ultimate price for a war that forgot her name. Before the German tanks rolled through the cobblestone streets of her village in May of 1940, Margaret Thornhill lived the kind of life that Hollywood would call boring. She had been born in Manchester, England in 1876, the daughter of a coal miner who died of black lung before she turned 10. At 22, she married a Belgian farmer named Henry Thornhill, a quiet man who grew potatoes and raised chickens on a plot of land just outside the town of Bastogne. They never had children, a wound that never quite healed, but they built a life of routines and small comforts. Every winter, Margaret would bake loaves of dark rye bread in her wood-fired oven, and every spring Henry would plant the same fields his father had planted before him. The farmhouse sat on a hill, isolated from the nearest neighbor by 3 kilometers of open fields, with a chimney so tall it could be seen from almost any direction. It was a landmark for travelers, a beacon for lost souls, and eventually a target for war. When the Germans invaded Belgium in the spring of 1940, Margaret was 64 years old and had already buried her husband 2 years prior. Henri had died of a heart attack while ploughing the North Field, and she had found him face down in the dirt, still gripping the reins of their old plough horse. She buried him under the oak tree behind the house, the same tree where they had shared their first kiss 42 years earlier, and she vowed to keep the farm running as long as her body allowed. The German occupation changed everything overnight. Soldiers set up checkpoints on every road, requisitioned food from every farm, and shot anyone who resisted. Margaret watched as her neighbors were dragged from their homes for hiding Jewish families, as young men were shipped off to labor camps in Germany, as women were assaulted in broad daylight with no consequences. The Nazis turned Bastogne into a military hub, storing weapons and fuel in warehouses just 5 kilometers from her farm, and they built a railway line that carried supplies straight to the Eastern Front. Margaret could have stayed silent. She could have kept her head down, baked her bread, and survived the war as thousands of others did. But something inside her refused to accept the occupation as permanent. She had lived through the First World War, had seen the Kaiser's army march through Belgium in 1914, and she had watched them retreat in defeat 4 years later. She knew that empires fall, that tyrants die, and that wars always end, but only if people fight back. The problem was that she was not a soldier, not a saboteur, not even particularly strong anymore. Her hands shook when she carried firewood, her back ached after an hour of work, and her eyesight was failing. What could an old woman possibly do against the most powerful military machine in Europe? The answer came to her one cold November morning in 1942, when she looked up at her chimney and realized that the smoke was visible from everywhere. She had noticed the British planes flying overhead at night, dropping bombs on German positions with increasing frequency, but their accuracy was terrible. They would miss their targets by kilometers, hitting empty fields or civilian homes, instead of the ammunition depots and fuel tanks that sat just beyond her farm. Margaret understood why. The pilots were flying in darkness, navigating by crude maps and guesswork, with no way to distinguish one patch of Belgian countryside from another. They needed a signal, a landmark, something to guide them to the exact location of the Nazi supplies, and Margaret realized that her chimney could be that signal. She began experimenting with different types of wood, learning how to control the color and density of the smoke, by adjusting what she burned. Wet oak produced thick white smoke that rose straight up. Dry pine created thin grey wisps that dissipated quickly, and green wood mixed with coal generated dark black plumes that hung in the air like storm clouds. She could write messages in smoke, she realized, if someone was watching from above. The next step was making contact with the Allies, and that was where the real danger began. Margaret knew that the Belgian resistance operated in the forests around Bastogne, but she had no idea how to reach them without getting herself killed. The Nazis had informants everywhere, neighbors who would sell out their own families for an extra ration of bread, and one wrong word could mean a bullet in the back of the head. She decided to take the risk anyway. One Sunday morning, she walked to the village church, the only place where people still gathered without raising German suspicion, and she waited for the right moment. After the service, she approached a young priest named Father Luke, a man she had known since he was a boy, and she whispered a single sentence that would change everything. She told him she wanted to help, and she asked him to send word to London. Father Luke did not respond immediately, and for 3 agonizing days Margaret heard nothing. She went about her daily routines with the same mechanical precision as always, feeding her chickens, chopping firewood, baking her bread, but every sound made her flinch. Every knock on the door could be the Gestapo coming to arrest her. Every footstep outside could be a German soldier sent to execute her for treason. She had made her move, and now all she could do was wait and pray that the young priest had not betrayed her. On the 4th night, just after midnight, she heard a soft tapping on her back window, the kind of sound that could easily be mistaken for a branch scraping against glass. She grabbed the kitchen knife she now kept under her pillow and crept to the window, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. When she pulled back the curtain, she saw Father Luke standing in the darkness, his face pale and drawn, and behind him stood 2 men she had never seen before. They wore civilian clothes, but they moved like soldiers, and their eyes scanned the shadows with the constant vigilance of men who expected death at any moment. Margaret let them inside without a word, and the 4 of them sat around her kitchen table in near silence, speaking only in whispers. The 2 strangers introduced themselves as members of the Belgian resistance, operatives who had been working with British intelligence since the occupation began. They told her that Father Luke had vouched for her, that London had been informed of her offer, and that they were there to determine if her plan was feasible. Margaret explained everything, pointing to her chimney and describing how she could control the smoke, how the plumes could be seen from high altitudes, and how she could use different patterns to communicate specific information. The resistance fighters listened carefully, asking questions about timing, visibility, and German patrols in the area. They wanted to know if she understood the risk, if she realized that the moment the Nazis figured out what she was doing, they would torture her for names and then shoot her in the town square as an example. Margaret looked them both in the eye and told them she had already buried everyone she loved, and that dying for something that mattered was better than dying for nothing at all. The plan took shape over the next 2 weeks, refined through a series of midnight meetings in Margaret's kitchen. The resistance provided her with a code book, a small leather-bound notebook filled with smoke patterns that corresponded to specific targets. A single thick column of black smoke meant ammunition depot, 2 short bursts of white smoke meant fuel tanks, and alternating black and white plumes meant troop transport trains on the nearby railway line. The bombers would fly over her farm at predetermined times, usually just before dawn when visibility was best, and Margaret would light her fire according to the intelligence the resistance had gathered. The system was brilliantly simple, almost primitive in its design, and that was exactly why it worked. The Germans were looking for radio transmitters, for coded letters, for underground networks of armed saboteurs, but they were not watching an old woman's chimney. Margaret practiced every night, learning to control the fire with the precision of a master craftsman, adjusting the airflow, timing the addition of fuel, creating smoke signals that could be read from miles away. She turned her grief into purpose, her loneliness into defiance, and her fireplace into a weapon of war. The first test came on a freezing morning in early December of 1942, when the resistance informed Margaret that a German ammunition train would be parked at the Bastogne railway depot for refueling. She woke at 4 in the morning, her fingers numb from the cold, and began building her fire according to the code. She burned wet oak mixed with coal, creating a thick black column that rose into the pre-dawn sky like a pillar of darkness. At exactly 5:30, she heard the distant rumble of engines, the unmistakable sound of British Lancaster bombers approaching from the west. She stood in her doorway and watched as they passed overhead, their silhouettes barely visible against the clouds. And then she waited. 3 minutes later, the horizon erupted in orange flame, the sound of the explosion rolling across the fields like thunder. The ammunition train had been destroyed, along with enough shells and bullets to supply an entire German division for a month. Margaret did not celebrate, did not allow herself even a moment of satisfaction, because she knew this was only the beginning. The Germans responded with predictable fury, launching investigations, interrogating villagers, and executing suspected resistance members in public hangings meant to terrify the population into submission. They never once looked at the old woman on the hill, the widow who baked bread and lived alone with her chickens. Margaret became invisible, protected by the very assumptions the Nazis made about age and gender and usefulness. Over the next 6 months, her chimney guided Allied bombers to 17 successful strikes, destroying fuel depots, supply convoys and troop barracks with devastating accuracy. The Germans could not understand how the British suddenly knew exactly where to bomb, how their intelligence had become so precise, and they tore the region apart looking for spies. Margaret watched it all from her kitchen window, lighting her fires, baking her bread, and sending men to their deaths with smoke signals that disappeared into the wind. She never wrote down their names, never allowed herself to think of them as human beings with families and dreams, because the moment she did, the moment she acknowledged what she was doing, she knew she would lose her nerve. By the spring of 1943, Margaret Thornhill had become a ghost in her own life, a woman who existed in 2 separate realities that never quite touched. During the day, she was the harmless grandmother the Germans saw when they passed her farm on patrol, the old woman who waved politely and offered them bread when they knocked on her door asking for food. She learned their names, asked about their families back in Germany, and played the role of the sympathetic civilian who had accepted the occupation as inevitable. But at night, she became someone else entirely, a cold and calculating operative who studied German movements with the precision of a military strategist. She kept mental notes of everything, the times when patrols changed shifts, the routes supply trucks took through the countryside, the locations where ammunition was stored before being shipped to the front. The resistance had taught her how to observe without appearing to watch, how to gather intelligence while pretending to hang laundry or feed chickens, and she had become frighteningly good at it. The system evolved as the months passed, becoming more sophisticated and more dangerous with each operation. The resistance began using Margaret's farm as a relay point, sending runners in the dead of night to deliver fresh intelligence about German positions. She would memorize the information, burn the written notes in her fireplace, and then translate everything into smoke signals the following morning. The codebook expanded to include more complex messages, patterns that indicated not just targets, but also timing, wind direction, and the number of bombers required for maximum damage. Margaret learned to read the sky like a farmer reads clouds before a storm, understanding how weather would affect visibility and adjusting her signals accordingly. She discovered that thick fog meant she needed darker smoke, that clear days allowed for more subtle variations, and that wind required her to create wider plumes that would remain visible even as they dispersed. She became an artist of destruction, painting death across the Belgian sky in shades of grey and black. The toll on her body was immense, but Margaret refused to slow down. Her arthritis worsened from the constant work of chopping wood and maintaining the fire, her hands becoming gnarled and twisted like the roots of an ancient tree. She slept no more than 3 or 4 hours a night, always listening for the sound of German vehicles approaching, always ready to destroy evidence and flee into the woods if necessary. Her diet consisted mostly of bread and thin vegetable soup, because she gave most of her food to the resistance fighters who visited her farm, men and women half her age, who looked at her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. They could not understand how someone so old, so fragile in appearance, could sustain such relentless work under conditions that would break most trained soldiers. Margaret never explained herself, never spoke about motivation or patriotism or revenge, because the truth was simpler and darker than any of them realized. She continued because stopping would mean acknowledging that Henri was truly gone, that her life had no purpose beyond waiting to die, and she was not ready to face that emptiness yet. The spring of 1943 brought a new level of German paranoia to the region, as Allied bombing campaigns intensified across occupied Europe. The Nazis began implementing stricter controls, requiring every civilian to register their activities, monitoring chimney smoke for unusual patterns, and executing entire families suspected of collaboration with the resistance. Margaret knew her window of safety was closing, that eventually someone would notice the correlation between her smoke and the bombing raids, but she also knew that the war was reaching a critical phase. The resistance told her that an Allied invasion was being planned, that every German soldier killed in Belgium was one less soldier who would be waiting on the beaches of France, and that her work was saving lives even as it ended others. She made peace with the mathematics of war, accepting that her small acts of sabotage were drops in an ocean of blood, but drops that mattered nonetheless. One morning in late April, as Margaret prepared her fire for another signal, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A German officer had positioned himself on the ridge overlooking her farm, standing perfectly still, with binoculars raised to his eyes. He was not part of the regular patrol, not one of the young soldiers she had learned to charm with fresh bread and kind words. This man was older, methodical, and he was watching her chimney with the focused intensity of someone conducting surveillance. Margaret continued her work as if nothing was wrong, lighting the fire exactly as she had planned, creating the smoke pattern that would guide bombers to a fuel depot 5 kilometers north. But as the smoke rose into the morning sky, she knew with absolute certainty that her time was running out, that the invisible protection of age and assumption had finally failed, and that the next knock on her door would not be a friendly patrol asking for food. The German officer returned the next day, and the day after that, always at the same time, always standing on the same ridge with his binoculars trained on Margaret's chimney. He never approached the house, never spoke to her, never gave any indication that he suspected anything beyond routine observation. But Margaret knew better. She had lived long enough to recognize the difference between casual surveillance and active investigation, and this man was building a case against her with the patient methodicity of a predator studying its prey. She considered stopping the signals entirely, going dark until the officer lost interest and moved on to other suspects, but the resistance had made it clear that the intelligence flowing through her farm was too valuable to interrupt. A major German offensive was being prepared somewhere in the region, and Allied command needed constant updates on troop movements, supply deliveries, and ammunition stockpiles. Margaret was their eyes on the ground, the single most reliable source of tactical information in a 50-kilometer radius, and shutting down her operation now could cost thousands of Allied lives when the invasion finally came. She made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of hiding or running, Margaret chose to escalate, to become so bold and so visible that the very audacity of her actions would seem like proof of innocence. She began inviting German soldiers into her home more frequently, offering them coffee and bread while they warmed themselves by her fireplace, the same fireplace she used to send coded messages to British bombers. She memorized their routines, learned their weaknesses, and used every conversation to gather more intelligence about German operations. One young soldier from Bavaria told her about the new anti-aircraft batteries being installed near the railway depot. Another mentioned the arrival of fresh panzer divisions being held in reserve for a counterattack, and a third complained about the constant Allied air raids that seemed to hit their targets with impossible precision. Margaret absorbed it all, filing every detail away in her mind, and then she would wait until they left before translating that information into smoke signals that sealed their comrades' fates. The psychological weight of this double life was crushing, smiling at men while planning their deaths, but she had long since stopped allowing herself the luxury of moral contemplation. The officer on the ridge, whose name she eventually learned was Major Klaus Richter, began conducting a systematic investigation of everyone living within sight of the bombing targets. He interrogated farmers, shopkeepers, and priests, looking for patterns of behavior that might indicate resistance activity. Margaret heard through the village gossip network that he had already arrested 2 families on suspicion of harboring Allied pilots, and that both families had been sent to concentration camps in Germany without trial. The net was tightening, and Margaret knew that sooner or later Richter would connect the dots between her Chimney and the bombing raids. She had perhaps 2 weeks, maybe 3, before he gathered enough evidence to act. The resistance offered to evacuate her, to smuggle her into France and then eventually to England, but Margaret refused. She told them that leaving would confirm Richter's suspicions and bring down the entire network, that her continued presence and apparent innocence was the only thing keeping them all alive. But the truth was more personal than strategic. She had decided that this farm, this chimney, this fireplace where she had cooked meals for Henri and baked bread for 40 years, was where her story would end, and she would not die running. The tension reached its breaking point on a grey morning in early May, when the resistance delivered the most important piece of intelligence Margaret had ever received. A massive German ammunition convoy was scheduled to pass through Bastogne in 3 days, carrying enough explosives to supply the entire Western Front for a month. The convoy would stop at the railway depot for refueling, remaining stationary for exactly 2 hours between dawn and full daylight, creating a perfect window for an airstrike. If the bombers could destroy this convoy, it would cripple German offensive capabilities for weeks, possibly months, and might even delay their planned counterattack long enough for the Allies to establish a stronger foothold when the invasion came. But the strike would require Margaret to send the longest and most complex smoke signal she had ever attempted, a pattern that would take nearly 30 minutes to complete and would be impossible to explain away as normal household activity. Major Richter would be watching, she knew, and the moment she lit that fire he would know exactly what she was doing. Margaret spent 2 days preparing, gathering the exact combination of wood and coal needed to create the signal, rehearsing the timing until she could execute it with her eyes closed. She wrote a letter to Father Luke, thanking him for his courage and asking him to pray for her soul, and she buried it in the garden under Henry's oak tree where the Germans would never find it. On the night before the convoy arrived, she sat in her kitchen and allowed herself one moment of weakness, one brief acknowledgement of the fear that had been building in her chest for months. She thought about Henri, about the life they had built together, about the children they never had, and the future that had been stolen from them by wars and empires and men who valued power over peace. She thought about the 67 years she had lived, the mundane routines and small joys that had filled her days, and she realized that everything she had been, everything she had done, had led her to this single moment. When dawn broke over the Belgian countryside, Margaret Thornhill lit her fireplace for the last time, and she created a smoke signal so perfect, so unmistakable, that it could be seen from 30,000 feet in the sky. The smoke rose into the pre-dawn sky in thick black columns, each plume carefully timed and controlled, creating a pattern that spelled out exact coordinates, timing, and the nature of the target. Margaret worked the fire with hands that no longer trembled, adding wet oak for dense black smoke, then switching to dry pine for thin grey wisps, then back to coal-soaked wood for another dark burst. She could see Major Richter on the ridge even in the dim light, his silhouette unmistakable as he raised his binoculars and focused directly on her chimney. She did not hide, did not pretend, did not even pause in her work. For 28 minutes she performed her deadly choreography, building and controlling the fire with the skill of someone who had done this 100 times before, and when the final plume dissipated into the morning air, she walked to her kitchen window and waited. She could see Richter descending from the ridge, moving quickly now, no longer observing but acting, and she knew that German vehicles would be arriving at her farm within minutes. She had perhaps 10 minutes of freedom left, 10 minutes to decide how this story would end. Margaret did not run. She poured herself a cup of ersatz coffee from the pot on her stove, the terrible chicory substitute that had replaced real coffee years ago, and she sat at her kitchen table in the same chair where she had eaten breakfast with Henri for 4 decades. She could hear the distant rumble of engines approaching, the mechanical growl of German military vehicles racing up the dirt road toward her farm. She thought about destroying the codebook, burning it in the fireplace to protect the other operatives in the network, but she realized it did not matter anymore. The resistance had already changed their codes, already moved to new safe houses, already adapted to the reality that her farm had been compromised. Her part in this war was finished, and what happened next would unfold regardless of what she did in these final moments. She sipped her terrible coffee and listened to the sound of boots on her front steps, heavy and deliberate, the footsteps of men who had come to kill. The door burst open without warning, German soldiers flooding into her small kitchen with rifles raised, and voices shouting commands in a language she had never bothered to learn. Major Richter entered last, moving with calm authority, his face expressionless as he surveyed the scene. He looked at Margaret sitting calmly at her table, at the fireplace still smouldering with evidence, at the chimney visible through the window, and something like satisfaction crossed his features. He had been right, his instincts confirmed, his weeks of patient observation finally validated. He gestured to his soldiers, and they seized Margaret by her arms, yanking her to her feet with a violence that sent pain shooting through her arthritic shoulders. Richter began asking questions in broken French, demanding to know who she worked for, how she communicated with the Allies, and what other operatives were part of her network. Margaret looked him directly in the eyes and said nothing, her silence more defiant than any words could have been. She had made her peace with death weeks ago, and she would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing her beg or break. The interrogation continued in her kitchen for nearly an hour, Richter's questions becoming more aggressive as Margaret's silence persisted. He threatened her with torture, with execution, with the destruction of the entire village if she did not cooperate, but she remained as still and quiet as stone. The soldiers searched her house, tearing through drawers and cupboards, looking for radios or weapons or written evidence of espionage, but they found nothing except an old woman's simple possessions and a fireplace that had been used exactly as fireplaces had been used for centuries. Richter knew what she had done, knew that her smoke had guided the bombers, but knowing and proving were different things, and without a confession or physical evidence, his case would remain circumstantial. He made a decision then, one born of frustration and military pragmatism, and he ordered his soldiers to take Margaret to the Gestapo headquarters in Brussels for enhanced interrogation. She would be transported that afternoon, held in a cell until professional interrogators could extract the information he needed, and then she would be executed as a spy and saboteur. But as the soldiers dragged Margaret toward the door, as Richter prepared to leave her farm and return to his command post, the sky above Bastogne began to fill with the sound of approaching aircraft. The British bombers had received Margaret's signal, had decoded her smoke pattern with perfect accuracy, and they were arriving exactly on schedule to destroy the German ammunition convoy. Richter's face went white as he realized what was about to happen, as he understood that this old woman had completed her mission even as she was being arrested, and that dozens of his countrymen were about to die because he had been too slow, too methodical, too committed to building an airtight case. He screamed orders at his soldiers, telling them to radio the convoy and warn them to disperse, but it was already too late. The first bombs fell at exactly 6:42 in the morning, striking the railway depot with devastating precision, and the ammunition convoy exploded in a fireball so massive that Margaret could feel the heat on her face even from 5 kilometers away. The windows of her farmhouse shattered from the concussion, the ground shook like an earthquake, and the morning sky turned orange with flame. Margaret smiled for the first time in months. Major Richter struck Margaret across the face with the back of his hand, the blow hard enough to split her lip and send blood running down her chin. His composure had shattered completely, his professional detachment replaced by raw fury as he watched the horizon burn with the destruction of an entire month's worth of German war materiel. He screamed at her in German, the words incomprehensible but the meaning clear, and his soldiers stood frozen in shock as their commanding officer lost control. Margaret did not react to the blow, did not raise her hand to her bleeding mouth, did not give him the satisfaction of seeing pain or fear in her eyes. She had won, and they both knew it. The convoy was destroyed, hundreds of German soldiers were dead or dying, and the Allied advance had been handed a victory that would ripple through the entire Western Front. Richter could torture her, could execute her, could erase her name from every record and bury her in an unmarked grave, but he could not undo what she had accomplished. The old woman had beaten the Third Reich with nothing but smoke and determination, and that reality burned worse than any fire. The journey to Brussels took 3 hours in the back of a military truck, Margaret's hands bound with rough rope and 2 armed guards watching her every movement. She sat in silence as the vehicle bounced along damaged roads, passing through villages that had been reduced to rubble by years of occupation and bombing. She saw civilians staring at the passing convoy with hollow eyes, children begging for food, and old men who looked away rather than witness another arrest. The war had devoured Belgium, had consumed its people and its future, and Margaret wondered if anything they were fighting for would survive the devastation. The truck passed within sight of the destroyed railway depot, where fires still burned, and German soldiers worked frantically to recover bodies and salvage whatever equipment had survived the blast. Margaret counted at least 40 craters, evidence of a bombing run so accurate and so thorough that it must have seemed like divine punishment to the men on the ground. She had done that, an old woman with a fireplace, and the knowledge gave her strength as the truck carried her toward whatever horrors awaited in the Gestapo cells. The Brussels headquarters was a requisitioned hotel that had been transformed into a fortress of fear, its elegant pre-war architecture now hiding interrogation rooms, holding cells, and execution chambers. Margaret was processed with bureaucratic efficiency, her personal information recorded in ledgers that would likely be destroyed before the war ended, and then she was led down a narrow staircase into the basement where prisoners were kept before interrogation. The cell was barely 2 meters square, with stone walls that wept moisture and a single wooden bench for furniture. There was no window, no light except what filtered through the barred slot in the door, and the air smelled of blood and human waste. Other prisoners occupied the cells nearby. She could hear them coughing and weeping and praying in languages she did not understand, and she realized that she was surrounded by people who had made the same choice she had, ordinary civilians who had decided that resisting was worth dying for. She sat on the bench and allowed herself to rest for the first time in days, her body finally acknowledging the exhaustion that had been building for months. The interrogation began the following morning, conducted by a Gestapo officer named Hauptmann Schmidt, who spoke perfect French and approached his work with the cold professionalism of a surgeon. He did not shout or threaten, did not strike her or promise immediate death, but instead asked questions with polite insistence as if they were discussing gardening techniques rather than espionage and mass murder. He wanted names, addresses, communication methods, the entire structure of the resistance network in the Bastogne region, and he made it clear that he had all the time in the world to extract this information. Margaret gave him nothing, not a single word beyond confirming her name and age, and Schmidt nodded as if he had expected this response. He explained calmly that resistance was pointless, that the Gestapo had broken tougher subjects than an elderly farm woman, and that prolonging the inevitable only increased suffering. He showed her photographs of other prisoners, men and women who had been tortured until they confessed, their bodies broken and their minds shattered, and he promised that she would look the same unless she cooperated. Margaret looked at the photographs without flinching and remained silent. The torture began on the 3rd day, and it was worse than anything Margaret had imagined in her darkest moments. Schmidt employed techniques designed to maximize pain while minimizing the risk of accidental death, methods refined through years of practice on countless victims. He wanted her alive and coherent enough to provide useful information, and he was willing to spend weeks achieving that goal. Margaret endured hours of beatings, electric shocks, and water torture, her body screaming for mercy, while her mind retreated to memories of Henri, of their farm, of quiet mornings before the war, when the only smoke rising from her chimney carried the scent of bread baking. She discovered reserves of strength she had not known existed, a core of defiance forged from decades of surviving poverty, loss, and loneliness. Schmidt broke her fingers one by one, shattered her ribs and burned her skin with cigarettes, but he could not break her silence. After 2 weeks, he admitted defeat, telling his superiors that the prisoner was either genuinely ignorant of wider resistance operations or possessed a willpower that transcended normal human capacity. Either way, she had no more intelligence value, and her execution was scheduled for the following Monday. Margaret spent her final days in that basement cell, drifting between consciousness and delirium, her broken body struggling to perform even the most basic functions. The guards brought her water and thin soup twice a day, not out of compassion, but to keep her alive long enough for the scheduled execution, and she forced herself to swallow despite the pain in her shattered ribs. She could no longer stand without assistance, could barely breathe without feeling like her chest was being crushed, and her broken fingers had swollen to twice their normal size, the bones grinding against each other with every involuntary movement. But her mind remained sharp, perhaps sharper than it had been in years, as if the approach of death had stripped away all the unnecessary thoughts and left only what truly mattered. She thought about the convoy she had destroyed, about the soldiers who would never reach the front lines, about the Allied lives saved by her smoke signals, and she calculated the mathematics of her sacrifice. Hundreds dead on one side, thousands saved on the other. Her single life exchanged for a strategic advantage that might shorten the war by days or weeks. By any rational measure, it had been worth it. On Sunday evening, the night before her execution, Father Luke appeared at her cell door, escorted by 2 German guards who looked uncomfortable with the entire situation. The Nazis had begrudgingly agreed to allow condemned prisoners a final confession, a concession to Catholic tradition that they found barbaric but politically necessary in occupied Belgium. Luke entered the cell and dismissed the guards with a gesture, promising them he would not attempt escape or smuggle contraband, and for 15 precious minutes he and Margaret were alone. He did not waste time with pleasantries or false comfort, did not tell her that God had a plan or that her suffering had meaning beyond the immediate tactical results. Instead, he told her the truth, the information that the resistance had risked everything to deliver. The destruction of the ammunition convoy had forced the Germans to delay their planned counter-offensive by 3 weeks, pulling troops from other sectors to compensate for the lost supplies. Allied intelligence had intercepted German communications, expressing shock at the precision of the bombing raid, with some officers suspecting a high-level intelligence breach rather than a simple smoke signal from an old woman's chimney. The resistance network in Bastogne had survived intact, having successfully evacuated all compromised operatives before the Gestapo could act, and Margaret's silence under torture had protected dozens of lives. Father Luke reached into his cassock and produced a small piece of paper, folded so tightly it was barely larger than his thumbnail. He pressed it into Margaret's unbroken palm and told her to memorize the words before destroying it, and she unfolded the paper with trembling hands to find a message from London. British intelligence had learned of her capture through resistance channels, and they wanted her to know that her work had not gone unnoticed, that her smoke signals had been recorded and analyzed, and that she had personally guided Allied bombers to 23 successful strikes over the course of 8 months. The damage she had inflicted on German war capabilities was estimated at over 40 million Reichsmarks, the equivalent of losing an entire armored division, and her intelligence had contributed directly to the planning of the upcoming Allied invasion. The message ended with a promise, a vow from commanders whose names she would never know, that when the war ended and the truth could finally be told, Margaret Thornhill would be remembered as one of the bravest operatives in the entire European theatre. She read the words 3 times, committing them to memory, and then she ate the paper, chewing it slowly until nothing remained but the taste of ink and fibre. Luke heard her confession then, the ritual words whispered in the darkness of a Nazi prison cell, and Margaret unburdened herself of sins both real and imagined. She confessed to pride, to the satisfaction she had felt watching German positions burn, to the cold calculation with which she had sent men to their deaths without knowing their names or seeing their faces. She confessed to doubt, to the moments when she had questioned whether her actions made any difference, whether one old woman could truly impact a war fought by millions. She confessed to fear, not of death itself, but of dying alone and forgotten, her story erased from history like Henri's grave would someday be erased by wind and rain. Luke listened without judgment, offering absolution with words that had been spoken over dying soldiers and executed resistance fighters for thousands of years, and when the ritual was complete, he embraced her carefully, mindful of her broken ribs, and whispered that she had done enough, that she could rest now that her war was over. The guards returned and led him away, and Margaret was alone again with her thoughts and her pain, and the knowledge that she had approximately 12 hours left to live. She did not sleep that final night, could not bear to waste her remaining time in unconsciousness when there was still so much to think about, so many memories to revisit one last time. She thought about her childhood in Manchester, about the coal dust that stained everything black and the sound of miners coughing themselves to death in the night. She thought about meeting Henri at a village dance in Belgium, about how shy he had been, and how she had needed to ask him to dance first because he would never have found the courage. She thought about their wedding, about planting their first crop together, about the baby she had miscarried in the second year of their marriage, and the 2 more that followed, each loss carving deeper wounds that never quite healed. She thought about the empty years after Henri died, about the loneliness that had threatened to consume her until the war gave her something to fight for, something to fill the void where her family should have been. And she thought about her chimney, about the smoke signals that had been her voice when all other forms of resistance seemed impossible, about how something as simple as burning wood could become an act of defiance powerful enough to shake an empire. Dawn came slowly, grey light filtering through the slot in her cell door, and Margaret heard the sound of boots approaching down the corridor. The execution squad had arrived, 6 soldiers and an officer, all of them looking like they would rather be anywhere else in the world. They opened her cell and helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as her legs buckled, and they led her up the stairs and out into a courtyard where a wooden post had been erected against a bullet-scarred wall. The morning air was cold and clean, the first fresh air she had breathed in weeks, and she filled her damaged lungs with it despite the pain. Other prisoners were being led out as well, a dozen men and women who had committed the crime of refusing to accept occupation, and they were lined up against the wall in a silent row. Margaret took her place among them, her back against the post, and she looked up at the sky one final time, watching the clouds drift overhead, wondering if smoke from some distant chimney was rising into that same grey expanse. The execution officer read out the charges in German, his voice flat and bureaucratic, reciting accusations of espionage, sabotage, and crimes against the Reich with the same tone one might use to read a grocery list. Margaret understood none of the words, but grasped their meaning from context and from the faces of the other condemned prisoners standing beside her. Some wept quietly, others prayed with moving lips, and one young man stood defiant with his chin raised and his eyes blazing with hatred. Margaret felt strangely calm, as if she were watching the scene from a great distance rather than living it, and she realized that the torture had burned away her capacity for fear along with so much else. The officer finished reading and stepped back, nodding to the firing squad, 6 young soldiers who looked barely old enough to shave and who gripped their rifles with white-knuckled hands. They had probably never executed civilians before, Margaret thought, had probably imagined war as something heroic and glorious, rather than standing in a cold courtyard shooting old women and shopkeepers. She almost felt sorry for them, for the nightmares they would carry home when this was over, for the moment they would realize that following orders did not absolve them of what they had done. The officer raised his hand, ready to give the command to fire, when the air raid sirens began to wail across Brussels. The sound cut through the morning like a knife, rising and falling in urgent waves, and within seconds the courtyard erupted into chaos. German soldiers ran for cover, shouting orders and scrambling toward the underground shelters, while the execution squad broke formation and sprinted for the nearest building. The condemned prisoners stood frozen against the wall, uncertain whether to run or remain, whether this was some kind of trick or a genuine Allied bombing raid. Margaret heard the distant rumble of aircraft engines, growing louder with each passing second, and she began to laugh, a sound that started as a quiet chuckle and built into something wild and uncontrollable. The timing was so perfect, so impossibly theatrical, that it seemed like divine intervention rather than military coincidence. The British were coming, drawn by intelligence reports or scheduled raids, or perhaps by some unconscious tribute to the woman who had guided them so many times before, and their arrival had interrupted her execution with split-second precision. The first bombs fell on the eastern edge of Brussels, targeting the railway yards and industrial complexes that fed the German war machine, and the concussion rattled windows and shook dust from the courtyard walls. More bombs followed, walking across the city in a methodical pattern, and Margaret could track their progress by sound alone, remembering the countless raids she had guided from her farmhouse kitchen. She knew exactly what was happening above those clouds, could picture the bomber formations releasing their payloads, could imagine the navigators checking coordinates and the pilots fighting to keep formation through flak and fighter attacks. One of those navigators might have used her smoke signals, might owe his life to intelligence she had provided, might be unknowingly bombing the city where she was about to die. The symmetry of it appealed to some dark part of her soul, the idea that her final moments would be accompanied by the sound of Allied bombs destroying German infrastructure, that she would die listening to proof that the work she had started would continue long after her death. The guards eventually remembered the condemned prisoners and herded them back toward the basement cells, abandoning the execution in favor of surviving the air raid. Margaret was half carried, half dragged down the stairs, her broken body unable to keep pace with the panicked soldiers, and she was thrown back into her cell with enough force to knock the air from her lungs. The door slammed shut, and she heard the lock engage, trapping her in darkness as the building shook from nearby explosions. She lay on the stone floor and listened to the symphony of destruction, to the screaming of air raid sirens, and the thunder of bombs, and the staccato bark of anti-aircraft guns trying desperately to bring down the attackers. The raid lasted for 43 minutes, long enough to reduce entire neighborhoods to rubble, and when the all-clear finally sounded, Margaret was still alive, still breathing, still waiting for death to claim her in whatever form it would take. The execution was rescheduled for the following morning, bureaucracy grinding forward with typical German efficiency despite the chaos of the bombing. But something had changed in that courtyard. Some psychological threshold had been crossed when the raid interrupted the killing, and the guards now looked at Margaret with a mixture of superstition and unease. Rumors spread through the prison that she had somehow summoned the British bombers, that her silence under torture proved she possessed supernatural protection, that executing her would bring bad luck or divine retribution. The officer in charge dismissed such talk as peasant nonsense, but even he seemed uncomfortable when he delivered the news of the rescheduled execution, as if some part of him wondered whether killing this old woman might anger forces beyond his understanding. Margaret said nothing to discourage their fears, maintaining the same iron silence she had held since her arrest, and she spent her final night listening to whispered prayers from neighboring cells and wondering whether Henri was waiting for her on the other side, whether death would reunite them or simply erase her from existence like smoke dissipating into empty air. The second attempt at execution proceeded with grim determination, the Germans refusing to allow superstition or coincidence to interfere with military justice. Margaret was brought to the same courtyard at dawn, her body so damaged from torture and neglect that 2 soldiers had to carry her to the post and tie her upright with ropes to keep her from collapsing. The other condemned prisoners from the previous day were gone, either executed privately or transferred to concentration camps, and Margaret stood alone against the wall facing the firing squad. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of perfect spring day that Henri would have loved, and she could see birds circling overhead, oblivious to the human drama unfolding below. The execution officer read the charges again, his voice sharper and more impatient than before, as if personally offended that this old woman had survived an extra 24 hours. The firing squad took their positions, raised their rifles, and waited for the final command. Margaret closed her eyes and thought about smoke rising from her chimney, about Henri's hands rough from farm work, about bread baking in her oven on quiet mornings before the world went mad. She had lived 67 years, and she was ready for it to end. The rifles fired in a ragged volley, the sound echoing off the courtyard walls like thunder in a confined space. Margaret felt the impact as a series of hammer blows to her chest and abdomen, pain so intense it transcended sensation and became something else entirely, a white-hot emptiness that spread through her body with terrible speed. She slumped forward against the ropes that held her upright, blood soaking through her dress and pooling on the cobblestones beneath her feet, and she waited for darkness to take her. But consciousness did not fade as quickly as she had hoped, did not grant her the mercy of instant death, and instead she hung there in a twilight state between living and dying, aware of every labored breath, every failing heartbeat. She could hear Boots approaching, the execution officer coming to verify the kill with a final bullet to the head, standard procedure to ensure no prisoner survived to tell stories. She wanted to tell him to hurry, to end it cleanly, but her voice had abandoned her along with so much else, and all she could do was wait. The officer stood before her, his pistol drawn, and Margaret forced her eyes open one last time to look at the man who would deliver her final moments. He was young, perhaps 30, with the face of someone who had aged a decade in 4 years of war. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, some shared understanding that transcended nation and ideology and the machinery of violence that had brought them to this moment. He raised his pistol to her temple, and Margaret saw his hand trembling, saw sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold morning air. He hesitated, the pistol wavering, and for a moment she thought he might refuse, might walk away and leave her to die slowly from her wounds. But duty reasserted itself, training overriding compassion, and his finger tightened on the trigger. The last thing Margaret Thornhill saw was the grey Belgian sky above the courtyard, the same sky she had written messages in with smoke and determination, and then the pistol fired, and the world went black and silent. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave on the outskirts of Brussels, dumped into a mass pit with dozens of other executed resistance fighters, all of them deemed too dangerous or too defiant to warrant individual burials. The Germans kept no records of her execution beyond a single line in a ledger, noting the disposal of prisoner number 7,412, cause of death listed simply as lawful execution for crimes against the Reich. Her farmhouse was confiscated and given to a German officer's family, her possessions sold or distributed, her chickens slaughtered for meat. Within weeks, it was as if Margaret Thornhill had never existed, as if the old woman who had guided Allied bombers with smoke signals was nothing more than a ghost story, whispered among resistance fighters. Major Richter wrote a brief report about her capture and execution, noting her refusal to cooperate under interrogation, but attributing the bombing accuracy to advanced Allied technology rather than anything as primitive as smoke signals. The report was filed and forgotten, buried in archives that would later be destroyed or captured, and the truth of what Margaret had accomplished vanished into the chaos of war. But stories have a way of surviving, even when physical evidence does not, passed from person to person, distorted and embellished but carrying kernels of truth that refuse to die. Father Luke survived the war and told Margaret's story to anyone who would listen, describing the old woman who had weaponized her chimney and paid for it with her life. The resistance fighters who had worked with her scattered across Europe, carrying memories of the grandmother spy who had never asked for recognition or reward, who had simply done what needed to be done because no one else could. British intelligence officers who had analyzed her smoke signals tried to track her down after the liberation, wanting to award her medals and honors, but they found only an unmarked grave and conflicting reports about an old woman executed in Brussels. Some said she had been a saboteur, others claimed she was a witch who could control the weather, and still others insisted the whole story was propaganda invented to boost morale. The truth became impossible to separate from legend, and eventually official histories of the war made no mention of Margaret Thornhill or her chimney, relegating her to a footnote in books that were themselves footnotes to larger narratives of battles and generals and political decisions. Here is what haunts me about Margaret Thornhill's story, what keeps me coming back to this forgotten corner of World War II history, even though official records barely acknowledge she existed. We live in an age that worships the spectacular, that demands our heroes wear capes and deliver speeches, and perform acts of courage so obvious that they cannot be ignored. But Margaret represents something far more terrifying and far more profound. The idea that the most important battles of our time might be fought by people we would never notice, using weapons so simple they seem almost ridiculous. A chimney, firewood, smoke. That was her entire arsenal, and with it she inflicted more damage on the Nazi war machine than most trained soldiers managed in years of combat. She did not ask for permission, did not wait for someone to recruit her or train her or tell her what needed to be done. She simply looked at the tools available to her, at the single advantage her circumstances provided, and she weaponized it with a ruthlessness that professional spies would have envied. The question that keeps me awake at night is this: how many other Margaret Thornhills died in unmarked graves without anyone ever knowing what they accomplished? The mathematics of her sacrifice are staggering when you actually sit down and calculate them. 23 confirmed bombing raids guided by her smoke signals over 8 months of operation. An estimated 40 million Reichsmarks in destroyed German materiel, hundreds of soldiers killed, critical supply lines disrupted at moments when the Allies needed every advantage they could get. Intelligence analysts after the war estimated that her work contributed to shortening the European campaign by approximately 2 to 3 weeks, and if that estimate is even remotely accurate, it means Margaret Thornhill saved thousands of Allied lives through nothing but observation, memory, and controlled combustion. But here is what breaks my heart about this story. She died believing her sacrifice might be forgotten, that her name would vanish into the same unmarked grave that swallowed her body. She never knew that British intelligence would spend years trying to find her after the war, that Father Luke would spend his entire post-war life documenting her story, that resistance fighters would tell their grandchildren about the old woman who fought the Nazis with a fireplace. She died alone and in pain, tortured and executed, with no assurance that any of it mattered. Think about what that means for a moment. Margaret Thornhill made the decision to become a spy at 64 years old, an age when most people are planning retirement or spending time with grandchildren. She had already lived through one world war, had already buried the love of her life, had already survived poverty and loss and loneliness that would have broken most people. She could have hidden, could have kept her head down, could have survived the occupation like millions of others who made the rational choice to prioritize their own survival. No one would have blamed her for choosing safety over resistance, for deciding that at her age, with her limitations, she had already given enough to a world that had taken everything from her. But she looked at what was happening around her, at the evil being normalized and the violence being accepted as inevitable, and she decided that doing nothing was worse than dying. That choice, that fundamental rejection of passivity in the face of atrocity, is what separates heroes from bystanders, and it is a choice that every generation must make in different forms. The lesson of Margaret Thornhill is not that we should all become spies or saboteurs or resistance fighters. The lesson is that impact has nothing to do with credentials or official permission or waiting for someone else to solve the problem. She had no training, no support network, no resources beyond what she could scavenge from her own failing farm. What she had was clarity about what needed to be done and the willingness to pay any price to do it. How many times in your own life have you seen something wrong, something unjust, something that demanded action, and you convinced yourself that you were not qualified to help, that someone more capable would handle it, that your contribution would be too small to matter? Margaret teaches us that those excuses are lies we tell ourselves to avoid risk, to protect our comfort, to maintain the illusion that we are not responsible for the world we eye. Habit. She teaches us that a single person with limited resources and unlimited determination can change the course of history, even if that change is never officially recognized or properly rewarded. So I want you to ask yourself this question, and I want you to answer it honestly, without the protective layers of cynicism or rationalization that we use to avoid uncomfortable truths. If you were in Margaret's position, if you saw a way to resist tyranny that would almost certainly cost you your life, would you take it? Would you sacrifice your remaining years, your physical safety, your comfortable obscurity for the possibility of making a difference? Or would you choose survival? Would you tell yourself that one person cannot change anything? Would you wait for someone else to be the hero? There is no wrong answer here, no. Judgment for choosing self-preservation over martyrdom. But the question itself is important because it forces us to confront who we actually are versus who we imagine ourselves to be. Margaret Thornhill made her choice on a cold November morning in 1942, and she paid for it with everything she had. Her story survives not because she sought recognition, but because people like Father Luke refused to let it die, because resistance fighters passed it down through generations, because somewhere in the collective memory of World War II, there remains a space for the old woman who fought the Nazis with smoke from her chimney. She deserves more than an unmarked grave and a disputed legend. She deserves to be remembered as what she truly was, proof that ordinary people can perform extraordinary acts of courage when they stop waiting for permission and start using whatever tools they have available. That is her legacy, and that is why her story matters more today than it did 80 years ago.